Our second speaker this morning is Brother Steve McGeorge from the Tea Tree Gully, Adelaide, Australia Ecclesia. The theme for Brother Steve's classes this week is The Levites, They Shall Be Mine. And today's class is entitled Gifts and Sacrifices. Brother Steve.
Okay, so today, gifts and sacrifices. We're going to leave soldiering and fighting and swords and militancy behind. We've done 2 studies on that because the truth is not just about fighting, is it? We do have to fight, that's true, but the truth is also about giving, about sharing, about helping, about reaching out, nurturing. You don't need swords to do that, do you? Swords would be the worst things to use for caring and sharing. You need something different, very different indeed. And the soldier who doesn't learn this lesson is never going to be a help to anyone, himself or his ecclesia or his family. He will stay a cold-hearted killer forever. A constant militant, seeing everything as a battle that he has to fight. That's not a soldier in the truth, brothers and sisters. That's a mercenary manifesting militant intolerance, mindless militancy. And we don't need mercenaries in our ecclesias. So let's follow this theme through, brothers and sisters. It starts back in Exodus 13. Because prior to the selection of the Levites, Yahweh appears to have worked through the firstborn of a family. The rights of the firstborn often related to matters of estate. They were given, weren't they, a larger inheritance, the double portion. They were given special paternal blessings. Think of Isaac, Esau, and Jacob. They were given the role of family leadership. They were honored at mealtimes. Think of the story of Joseph and Benjamin. Benjamin was honored, but that wouldn't normally be the practice. The firstborn would be the one that would be honored. And the importance of the firstborn, we know, is highlighted specifically at the time of their leaving Egypt. Come to Exodus 13. We know this because in Exodus 13, verse 2, sanctify unto me all the firstborn. Whatsoever openeth the womb among the children of Israel, both of man and of beast, it is mine. So specifically at the time of the Passover and the 10th plague, Yahweh makes it plain that all the firstborn belong to him. You can jot down Exodus 22, verse 29. The firstborn belongs to him. But it does appear, brothers and sisters, that there was a further role regarding the firstborn that's a little more hidden in the text. A role where the firstborn offered the sacrifices, was the representative of the family, and who acted as the priest in the family. Now, why do we say that? We'll come to Exodus 19. In Exodus 19, we have the constitution of the kingdom beginning here, when God makes them a kingdom. But he doesn't just make them a kingdom. In chapter 19, verse 6, we find, and ye shall be unto me a kingdom of priests. So although they became a kingdom, they also became priests. But that privilege of the priesthood, brothers and sisters, was going to be taken from the nation of Israel. But they did begin as priests. How? Well, I'm going to suggest through the representative firstborn. So have a look at verse 22. So this is the day they were consecrated as a nation. They became constituted as a kingdom of priests. And we read in verse 22, and let the priests also which come near to Yahweh sanctify themselves, lest Yahweh break forth upon them. Now, who are these priests in verse 22? These can't be associated in any special way with the tribe of Levi, can they? Or the family of Aaron, as neither of those have been chosen yet. So who are they? We'll come over to chapter 24. Exodus 24 and verse 5. And he sent young men of the children of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen unto Yahweh. These young men, brothers and sisters, appear not to be in any special way related to Levi either. Even the two specially ordained men, the two that were chosen to make the tabernacle furniture, they weren't from Levi. They were from Judah and Dan, Bezaleel and Aholiab in Exodus 31. In fact, the consecration of the Levites doesn't occur until chapter 32 in the story, further on. Just come to chapter 32 and see how this takes place. So it would seem, brothers and sisters, that in the first instance, the priests were the firstborns of the family. They are mine, says Yahweh, and they are those young men offering the priest's role of doing the offerings, of burnt offerings and peace offerings. So here in Exodus 32, which we've alluded to, we saw how the blessings of Moses actually pick up. Exodus 32, we saw that in our first study. But let's now go a little bit deeper into the period of time in Israel's history when the Levites were consecrated. Come down to verse 26. We know the story. We know the golden calf has been made. Aaron somehow magically put it in, and out came this calf, he said. Remember? He had the intentions of doing it for a feast to Yahweh. But everybody else had different intentions. They rose up to play, the record says. And Moses is told by God, get down. And as he comes down, he meets Joshua, and Joshua says, I think there's a war in the camp. And Moses says, that's not a war. Joshua, poor Joshua, he had no idea what it was like to party, did he? He didn't recognize that sort of language, that sort of behavior. He thought it must have been a war. That's what it sounded like to him. So down comes Moses and Joshua. And in verse 26, it says that Moses stood in the gate of the camp and said, who is on Yahweh's side? Let him come unto me. And all the sons of Levi gathered themselves together unto him. Here they are, standing out for the first time. We suggested that there was a hint that they're already beginning to stand out back in Exodus 17, but the language is a bit clumsy. You can't really tell what's going on. But here, they definitely are standing forward. These are the brethren of Moses and Aaron and Miriam. They're following their example, and they step forward. And in verse 27, Moses says, go and slay every man, his brother, his companion, his neighbor. That would include Simeonites, by the way. Go and kill them. And in verse 28, 3,000 died. And the reason given for doing this is in verse 29. For Moses had said, consecrate yourselves today to Yahweh. Then every man, even every man upon his son and upon his brother, that he may bestow upon you a blessing this day. So here it is, the consecration of the Levites begins in Exodus 32. This word to consecrate is made up of two words. You'll actually see in the margin that the margin tries to show you what the meaning of the words are. It means to fill your hands. Made up of two words. Mala means to fill, and yad, the open hand. To fill your hands. Well, why a hand? Well, a hand symbolizes all the work a man can do. When you try and do stuff, all right, imagine just using your feet all the time. Or imagine just using your elbows. You wouldn't get much done, would you? Dressing this morning, you would have used your hands. Hands are symbolic of everything a man does. By filling their hands with Yahweh's work, they were being consecrated to him. And this moment in Israel's history was to mark a fundamental change as to who was to be Yahweh's designated representatives of the nation. Because what happened here changed things. The sin of the golden calf caused two significant changes to be implemented immediately. The firstborn's role as priests was going to be removed from them and would go to solely Aaron and his sons. And the firstborn's role as spiritual leaders was going to be taken from them and given to the Levites. So the firstborn, who were representatives of the nation before, but because of this sin with the golden calf, that role would be removed and it would be given and split between Aaron and his sons on the one hand and the Levites on the other. And the word consecration, the idea of consecration, is seen in both changes. In fact, both are formally consecrated into their roles in due course, and both occasions are remarkably similar. So come to Leviticus 8, and just briefly, let's have a look at the consecration of Aaron and his sons. That role gets taken away from the firstborn and gets given to Aaron and his sons in Leviticus chapter 8. We find here in Leviticus chapter 8 the formal consecration of Aaron and his sons. And there are three offerings that are made. In verse 14, you'll see that there was a bullock for a sin offering, and then there are these two rams. Verse 18, one ram for a burnt offering. Verse 22, one ram for consecration. And these two rams are going to be linked together. In verse 22, we find about this ram of consecration. We're told that it's the ram of consecration. And as we've seen, this word consecration means to fill up. The ram of filling up your hands. And in verse 27, this ram of consecration was going to be put into the arms of Aaron and his sons, and this ram would be waved before Yahweh. The ram of consecration was going to be put as a wave offering. And a wave offering is when you went side to side. Okay? A heave offering was when you went up and down. But this was a wave offering, being waved before Yahweh. But notice in verse 28 that Moses took them from off their hands and burnt them on the altar upon the burnt offering. So that ram of the burnt offering gets linked with the ram of consecration. They waved it before Yahweh, and then Moses went and put it on top of the burnt offering. They were joined together, demonstrating Yahweh's acceptance and approval. Now, what do you know about the burnt offering? There are 5 basic altar offerings, Leviticus 1 to 7. They all have different features. The one unique feature about the burnt offering is that Yahweh got the lot. Nothing was held back. Nothing was given to the priests. Nothing was given to the offerers to eat. Yahweh received all of it. And this ram of consecration is now linked with the burnt offering. Everything's going to go to God. But note this, down in verse 29. And Moses took the breast and waved it for a wave offering before Yahweh. For of the ram of consecration, it was Moses' part, as Yahweh commanded Moses. So a portion of that ram was given back to Moses. And then down in verse 31, Moses said unto Aaron to his sons, boil the flesh at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation, and there eat it with the bread that is in the basket of consecration. So the rest of the flesh was given back to Aaron and his sons. They got the rest. So this linking with the burnt offering only went so far. God gave back a portion to Moses and a portion to Aaron and his sons. But there's clearly a link between the ram of the consecration and the burnt offering. Now, this is exactly the same language. All that we've just seen in Leviticus chapter 8 happens again when the formal consecration of the Levites take place, when they then assume the role of the firstborn as the spiritual leaders. They were to fill their hands with his work. And because they did, Yahweh says he would take all the Levites instead of the firstborns. We'll get to the formal consecration of the Levites in a moment. I want you to come to Numbers chapter 3 and just consider for a moment the numbering of the Levites. Because this exchange from firstborns to Levites was going to be a formal process. Numbers chapter 3, verse 39, we find that all that were numbered of the Levites, which Moses and Aaron numbered at the commandment of Yahweh throughout their families, all the males from a month old and upward were 22,000. So there are 22,000 Levites. And remember, the Levites are going to be taken instead of the firstborns. The firstborns were going to have to be redeemed for this role reversal to take place, this transition. Now, some of you who are good at math will know that the actual number of Levites, if you were to count them up, in verse 22, there were 7,500 from the family of Gershon. In verse 28, there was 8,600 from the family of Korah. And then in verse 34, there were 6,200 from the family of Merari. You add all of that up, and you actually get 22,300. But verse 39 says that there were only 22,000. Well, here's my suggestion. Some of you may have a different suggestion. If you're going to redeem every firstborn with a Levite, one for one, the suggestion is that 300 of the Levites were also firstborn. So they're dropped off. And there's 22,000 that can be used to redeem the firstborn. That's just a suggestion. If you're adding the numbers up, you'll find that discrepancy. I think it's a sensible one. But in verse 41, every Levite was going to be taken instead of the firstborn. One Levite for one firstborn. How many firstborns are there? Well, in verse 43, we find out that there are 22,273 firstborns. So there's more firstborns than there are Levites to be redeemed. So one Levite for every firstborn, that would count for 22,000 firstborn, but there's 273 left over. Well, they had to be redeemed by paying 5 shekels of silver. 5 shekels of silver. Silver, the metal for redemption. Okay, so just bear that in mind. That's what's happening. There's a formal process of moving from firstborns to the Levites. Because God says, I'm taking the Levites now because the firstborns and the nation and the sin of the golden calf means they're not able to continue in the role of priests or in the role of spiritual leaders. So come to Numbers chapter 8 now. How did the formal process, the formal consecration of the Levites take place? Just remember that number 273, by the way. We're going to see that a little bit later. Well, in Numbers chapter 8 and verse 6, it says, take the Levites from among the children of Israel and cleanse them. I want you to take the Levites. Verse 14, thus shalt thou separate the Levites from among the children of Israel, and the Levites shall be mine. So separate them. Well, wasn't Israel, the nation, already separated from the nations around? Well, yes, they were. But what God's saying here is that I'm going to now separate and Israel from within Israel. I'm going to have a group of called out ones from a larger group of called out ones. So how did this happen? Well, here we have the formal consecration of the Levites. And have a look. It matches up with Leviticus 8 with the formal consecration of the priests. The same thing is happening again because they're taking over the role of the firstborns in both cases. So in verse 7, the Levites had to be washed. Well, that's what the burnt offering had to be washed. And in verse 8, there were 2 young bullocks, one for a burnt offering, one for a sin offering. And then in verse 10, all Israel came and put their hands on the Levites. And then in verse 11, let's read verse 11, and Aaron shall offer the Levites. Have a look at the margin. It means to wave. They were a wave offering. They shall offer or wave the Levites before Yahweh for a wave offering. You'll see in the margin again, the word offering is wave offering. So here they are, they're putting their hands on the Levites, and the Levites are a wave offering before Yahweh. The idea of consecration, isn't it? As you saw in Leviticus chapter 8. And then in verse 12, the Levites shall lay their hands upon the heads of the bullocks, and thou shalt offer the one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering unto Yahweh to make an atonement. And in this way, verse 14, in this way you shall separate the Levites, and thus the Levites shall be mine. Because in verse 16, they are wholly given unto me. Just have a look at that, brothers and sisters. Wholly given unto me. What was the only offering under the law that was wholly given to God? That the priest could hold nothing back for, or the offerer could hold nothing back for? The burnt offering. They're being offered as a burnt offering, you see. In fact, this word wholly given, one of those quaint Hebraisms where the word holy is actually the same word. It really means given. They were given. Now, isn't that interesting? Do you remember our first study? What was Simeon and Levi like? What was their attitude about giving? Do you remember the story of Genesis 34? Where there was a little bit of give and take, but at the end of the story, we found they weren't prepared to give anything, were they? Actually, it was all about take. They took their sheep, they took their oxen, they took their wives, they took their children. They were takers. What a change in Levi. There's nothing about taking in Numbers chapter 8. It's all about giving. They've gone from take to give. That's a change in Levi and the tribe. This is a very different story. They've given themselves totally to Yahweh and they expect nothing in return. You see, Yahweh's holiness now, brothers and sisters, means more to them than their father, their mother, their brother, or their sister. It's not about Dinah at all. Natural lineages means nothing. We want to belong to Yahweh's family, they said. So Yahweh says, they're mine. So here we are. Maybe you'd like to colour in some phrases to emphasise this or take note of where this idea comes from. I'll just put them up and show you. I've gone and coloured them. It just helps to stand out off the page. The phrase take the Levites occurs in Numbers 3, verse 12, 41 and 45. And then in chapter 8, verse 6, it's take the Levites. And in verse 18, it's taken the Levites. So the idea of take comes up a lot, doesn't it? I will take the Levites for myself. The word separate the Levites occurs in chapter 8, verse 14. And then this phrase, which has been our title all week, which I've told you comes from Malachi chapter 3. Well, Malachi chapter 3 has borrowed it from Numbers chapter 3 and chapter 8. The Levites shall be mine. They shall be mine. Chapter 3, verse 12. Chapter 3, verse 13. Chapter 3, verse 41. Chapter 3, verse 45. Chapter 8, verse 14. They shall be mine. And the reason? Because they had wholly given themselves to him. They had filled their hands, consecrated their hands with his work. They presented themselves as a gift, basically. Now, this was a gift without conditions, brothers and sisters. This wasn't long-term borrowing, the people that say, I'll give it back to you, and you never see it again. Okay? This isn't long-term borrowing. There's no clause here on page 5 of the contract, paragraph 32.5. We reserve the right to opt out at any moment of our church. None of that. Yahweh, we are yours. We love your ways. We're prepared and willing to work on your behalf. We belong to you unconditionally. Now, this is unique, brothers and sisters. This is unheard of. We know of individuals who have shown this spirit, like Noah and Abraham, but this is a whole tribe. Such was the power of influence for good displayed, I'm going to suggest, by Levi in the first instance, with his daughter, Jochebed, his youngest daughter, born in his old age, and then infused in Moses, Miriam, and Aaron, that then went out and spread out over a whole tribe. That was the power and the influence that Levi must have displayed later in his life as he looked back on all his errors and changed his ways and reformed, only to see down the track his descendants rise up. When Moses said, "Who is on Yahweh's side?" they stood tall. And this tribe stood out from all the sons of Jacob. And Yahweh says, I can use people like you. And he gives them a work to do, and they readily fill their hands. And so he takes them instead of all the firstborns. But I want you to notice now in Numbers 8, verse 19, what God does next. He says, and I have given the Levites as a gift to Aaron and his sons to work in the tabernacle. Now, remember the ram of consecration back in Leviticus chapter 8? God gave back that ram to Aaron and his sons and to Moses. Well, he does the same thing here, but this time he does it with people. He does it with the Levites. He gives them back to Aaron as a gift to Aaron. So they had given themselves as a gift to God, and God turns around and says, now I can give you as a gift to the tabernacle, to the priesthood, to the worship of the tabernacle. And he gives all of the Levites back. Now in Numbers, this idea of being given as a gift, it comes up in Numbers 3. Thou shalt give the Levites unto Aaron his sons, they are wholly given unto him. It comes up in Numbers 8, verse 19. I have given the Levites as a gift to Aaron, which we just saw. And it comes up again in Numbers 18, verse 6. I have taken your brethren the Levites from among the children of Israel, for they are given as a gift. Just come to Numbers 18 and just see this idea get taken further. Numbers 18, verse 2. And thy brethren also of the tribe of Levi, he's talking to Aaron, the tribe of thy father, bring thou with thee that they may be joined unto thee. The Levites were to be joined to Aaron. That's how close this connection would be. What does Levi's name mean, brothers and sisters? It means to be joined. Here they are, being joined. Joined at the hip with Aaron and his family, the priesthood, and minister unto thee. But thou and thy sons with thee shall minister before the tabernacle of witness. And so Levi, who for so long was joined to Simeon at the hip, those two brothers, thick as thieves, who have been saying, joined together in a spirit of self-will, taking from others in acts of violence, is now joined to Yahweh in a spirit of self-sacrifice, giving everything to him. And Yahweh says, they are mine. That's exactly the type of people I can use. And he promptly turns around and gives them back to Aaron and his sons. Now, there's a really powerful lesson in this, brothers and sisters. It's telling us that it's never too late to change. You can influence others for good. You can. Levi changed. Yes, it was in his old age, but it's never too late to change. And God loves those who give everything to him, those that fill their hands with his work. Now, I mentioned to you to remember the number 273. Just come over to Acts 27. There's an incident here where they're on a boat, it's shipwrecked. Paul's a captive, he's been taken to Rome, and they're in dire straits. What's going to happen? How's this boat going to be redeemed? How are those that are on board going to be saved? Well, it's quite remarkable that in Acts 27, brothers and sisters, we have all the language of the Levites. Paul says this in verse 22, there shall be no loss of life. They'll all be redeemed. That's the same as Numbers 3, verse 46. Paul says, whose I am, in verse 23. There stood by me this night an angel, whose I am. I belong to God, you see. They shall be mine, Numbers 3:12 said. Whom I serve, he went on to say in verse 23. Well, the Levites were chosen to do the service, Numbers 3 verse 7. And then, remarkably, in verse 24, the angel said to Paul, fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar, and lo, God hath given thee all them that are with thee. They were wholly given to Paul, just the same as the Levites were wholly given to Aaron. How many people were on board this ship? Well, there were 276, brothers and sisters. But if you account for Paul, Luke, and Aristarchus, who were already followers, who were already redeemed, who were already believers, it left 273 unredeemed persons. That's the only other place in the Bible where you come across this number, 273. It's the process of redemption with the Levites being played out in the story of Paul in Acts 27. So what happens next in the story back in Numbers chapter 8? We'll come back to Numbers. Or Numbers chapter 10, I should say. Let's come back to Numbers chapter 10. In Numbers chapter 10, we get given the order of their marching. Numbers chapter 10, Moses offers two prayers. One every time they started marching, and one every time they concluded marching. One prayer in verse 35 and one prayer in verse 36. As they started to dismantle and start moving, Moses offered this prayer, rise up, Yahweh, and let thine enemies be scattered, and let them that hate thee flee before thee. And when they finally came to where the cloud stopped, then Moses would offer another prayer, return, O Yahweh, unto the many thousands of Israel. And he would offer that prayer, and they would stop, and they would re-erect the tabernacle and camp there for a while. What we want to do now, brothers and sisters, we want to take that language, the two prayers here in Numbers chapter 10. We want to take the ideas of obeying Yahweh, whatever the costs. We want to take the idea of belonging to him, they shall be mine. We want to take the idea of being a gift and see what else Scripture has to say about these things. So come to Psalm 68. Psalm 68 is based on Numbers 10. Psalm 68 is a psalm written by David bringing the ark to Jerusalem. And remember, he's not going to bring it to the old tabernacle. He's going to make a new tabernacle. And he pens this psalm. And it's obvious that he is modeling his movements of Yahweh's ark on the first time the ark is moved in Numbers 10. So see how he opens this psalm. In verse 1, we have a direct quote from Numbers 10, verse 35, when the ark began to move. Remember what Moses says? Rise up, Yahweh, and let thine enemies be scattered. Well, how does Psalm 68 begin? Let God arise, let his enemies be scattered. So he's saying the prayer of Moses in Numbers 10. And then in the next part, it talks about the journeying of the ark the first time. He talks about the history, and then coming down to verse 16, we have a description of the place where the ark would finally rest. And this is the place that God always intended for him to finally rest. So here's the ark coming home. In verse 16, we find, why leap ye, ye hills? This is the hill which God desired to dwell in. Yea, Yahweh will dwell in it forever. It's Mount Zion, isn't it? That's where David was bringing that ark, to the holy hill of Zion. And then in verse 17, brothers and sisters, we have what Moses said in his second prayer in Numbers chapter 10. The many thousands. The chariots of God are 20,000, even thousands and thousands. The Lord is among them as Sinai in the holy place. So he quotes Moses' prayer at the beginning and at the end of this section in Psalm 68. What he's saying is that what began at Sinai will happen again at Mount Zion. That was a pre-run. What David is doing is also a pre-run of a greater time when the ark, whatever the ark represents, and we believe it's the saints with Christ, when the ark finally rests in Jerusalem in the future. But look at what verse 18 says. There are 5 things that he mentions here as the conclusion, the crescendo of the final arriving of the ark into Mount Zion. It will be the time, he says in verse 18, when God will have ascended on high. Well, he did back then in Exodus. He went on Mount Sinai. He ascended on high. The second point is, thou hast led captivity captive. Well, he did back then, didn't he? The Egyptians were drowned. They'd never be captives by the Egyptians again. He took captivity captive. He took the captors captive. He drowned them all. But then it says, thou received gifts for men. What's that? Well, that phrase, gifts for men, isn't really making any sense. It's not what the original means. You'll see in the margin it means gifts in the man, and that doesn't seem to clear it up anymore. Rotherham says that he received gifts consisting of men. Well, we know what that was. In Numbers 8, that was the Levites. They were a gift, and they consisted of men, and they were given to God. And so, see how he's recounting all the events back then and says, this is the climax. That's what happened back then. That's what's happening here. And of course, David had 24,000 that gave themselves to the tabernacle, to the temple worship, didn't he? We saw that yesterday. They were a gift consisting of men. Yea, of the rebellious also. Well, Levi hadn't always been acceptable. They changed. The rebellious changed. And that's why in verse 18 at the end, that Yahweh might dwell among them. Now Yahweh could dwell among them. And of course, David received many gifts of men. I said 24,000. It was actually 38,000, wasn't it? 38,000, including Nethinim, and they willingly offered themselves up. So can you see that Psalm 68 is clearly based on Numbers 8? I hope that's made sense. Now come to Ephesians 4, brothers and sisters, and have a look at this. Paul in Ephesians 4 has all these thoughts in mind. Writing to the Ephesians, he says this: in the section dealing with the crucial idea of unity, Paul describes God as a unit. And because God is a unit, hence that means there can only be one body, one faith, one baptism, etc. But although we're united, although we're one, we are still diverse. We are still different. There are many of us in verse 7, but unto every man, every one of us is given grace according to the measure of the gift of Christ. There are many of us, but we've got different abilities, varying degrees of abilities, according to the measure of the gift of Christ. So, what's this gift that's mentioned here in verse 7? What's Christ doing, giving gifts? Because Paul says Christ had a gift to give. Well, it's at this point in Ephesians that Paul quotes from Psalm 68. Have a look at verse 8. Wherefore he saith, when he ascended up on high, he led captivity captive and gave gifts unto men. So Paul, to prove his case that gifts were given, quotes from Psalm 68. But there's one major difference. I don't know if you have this marked in. If you don't, I would suggest you mark it in. Paul quotes from Psalm 68, but he changes one thing. Because what did Psalm 68 say? Psalm 68 said that God received gifts consisting of men. Paul here says that he interprets Psalm 68 as God gave gifts consisting of men. Paul's misquoted, you might say. Paul's got this wrong. We could say the Bible's a contradiction. He fudged this one up. Well, he didn't, brothers and sisters, because Paul knows that Psalm 68 was based on Numbers 8. And in Numbers 8, both things happened. In Numbers 8, the Levites gave themselves to God. And in Numbers 8, God gave them back to Aaron and his sons. So both are correct. Giving gifts to God, consisting of men, and receiving gifts from God, consisting of men. And here in Ephesians 4, Paul is going to talk about the ones that were given by God. And who were they? We'll have a look. Verse 11. And he gave, here's the gifts, consisting of men, apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors, some teachers. He gave gifts consisting of men who could teach and help in ecclesial life in the first century. Now, was Paul right to do that? Obviously he was. Because Paul knows that Psalm 68, which he's quoting from, is based on Numbers 8. Psalm 68 said God received gifts. Paul here is saying God gave gifts, but both of those things are found in Numbers 8. What's the point, brothers and sisters? I think there's an incredibly powerful point here, brothers and sisters. A point which, if you don't remember anything else this week from these studies, I hope you remember this one. This would be the most important point you'll ever learn about the Levites. And the point is this. God can only give you as a gift to help others if you first have given yourself as a gift to Him. If you're holding back, if you can't give everything to Him, if you can't be that burnt offering, He can't use you. You don't belong to Him. And if you don't belong to Him, then He can't give you to someone because He doesn't own you. Ever tried giving a gift to someone that doesn't actually belong to you? You know, it's their birthday and you give them a new lawnmower, but you find out later that it was the neighbour's lawnmower. It wasn't actually yours to give. I mean, how does that work? You can't give a gift that doesn't belong to you. What are you giving yourselves time to, brothers and sisters? If you're giving yourself to sport, or you're giving yourself to a hobby, or you're giving yourself to work, and you're using all your time in those areas, what sort of gift could you ever be to your ecclesia, to your family? What are you an expert in? What takes up your time? Well, Paul talks about the gift that God saw as essential in helping his ecclesia, their teaching roles. And everybody can be a teacher, even by example. An ecclesia which doesn't know where it's going is an ecclesia waiting for a shipwreck to happen in verse 14, tossed by every wind of doctrine. But an ecclesia with individuals that have given themselves to God, well, that's an ecclesia that can hold together. Verse 16, hold together, joined together. That's the meaning of Levi's name. Now, who is a Levite that lived this principle? Yesterday, we saw an example of someone that was a porter, Phineas. Well, who's somebody that was a Levite that was a gift? That it's about giving yourself to God as a gift, holding nothing back and expecting nothing in return. To love God more than whole burnt sacrifices. Well, I'm going to suggest, and we're doing this with the young people actually next door, the example of a gift was Samuel. Samuel was a gift by his mother to God. He was given to God as a gift from birth. His life actually began as a silent but heartfelt prayer from a faithful Levite mother who trusted in God, and she gave him to God. And then God turned around and gave Samuel back to the nation. And my series next door with the young people, I've entitled Samuel as Israel's greatest reformer. And he was. Why? Because he had the best start in life. Hannah knew that the only way anyone might ever be able to change that corrupt priesthood was if a child came along who knew what it meant to be a sacrifice. And so she gave Samuel the best start he could ever have, her own example and attitude of self-sacrifice. And her attitude lived on in him, even though she only saw him once a year. You live with mum and dad until you're about the age of 3. And then only once every year after that. But Samuel knew why. He loved his mother. But they both knew that a relationship with God was far more important. But here's the greatest Levite, brothers and sisters. Let's go through a couple of verses here. Here's the Lord Jesus Christ, the greatest Levite. What did he do all his life? Well, Psalm 40 says, I delight to do thy will, not my will, but thine be own. He gave himself to his Father. Isaiah 50 says exactly the same thing, doesn't it? I was not rebellious. My ear was open every waking moment. I gave myself to my Father. Well, what did God do with that gift of his Son to him? Well, John 3:16, God gave him back to us. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. Just turn with me to John 17, brothers and sisters. John 17. All the way through this wonderful prayer, I want you to notice these words. All the way through this prayer, Jesus talks about the men that God gave him. The men which you gave me, verse 6, thine they were, thou gave them to me. I pray only for them whom thou gave to me, for they are thine. Keep those which thou gave to me. And then he says this, in John 17, verse 12, I have lost none, except the son of perdition. Isn't that interesting? It means the son of destruction. You see, this individual was somebody else's son. God didn't own this son. So he couldn't give this son to Jesus for Jesus to use how he wished. This son was owned by somebody else. So he was not God's to give to Christ. I think that's an amazing thing. That's all the language of the Levites that we've seen this morning about gifts. And of course, those are the men that Paul talks about in Ephesians 4. He gave them as apostles, teachers, etc. It had its roots in John 17 in his prayer. But we are included in this prayer, brothers and sisters. In verse 20 to 26, Jesus says, "Neither pray I for these alone, but for them also that shall believe on me through their word, that they may all be one as you are." That's us as well. We can be part of this Levitical family, brothers and sisters. What are you doing to be part of the family that's owned by the Father, that can then be given back to your ecclesia and to your family to help it get to the kingdom? That's a question you all have to answer for yourselves as you go home from Shippensburg. So what have we learnt this morning, brothers and sisters? Have we given ourselves totally and unconditionally to Yahweh as a burnt offering? Can Yahweh give us back as a gift to our families and ecclesias, or are we not his to give? Do you belong to somebody else? Do we fill our hands with Yahweh's goodness for the benefit of his other children? And when the world looks at us, as they will next week, can they see that we have been separated to God, that we belong to him? So there's no second guesses this morning as to which part of Malachi we're referring to in verses 16 there, 16 to 18, because this is our title for the week. "And they shall be mine, says Yahweh of hosts, in that day when I make up my jewels." Yahweh's desire to join us to him forever, to claim us as his own and to declare us to the world that these individuals now belong solely to him. That's God's desire, to be Levites for eternity.